this evening, honest to God, we have three of the most central players in this whole saga. And I think you might even agree to me, it was a saga sometimes. It might have felt that way a little bit.
It was a soap opera.
I'm going to start with very brief introductions so we don't steal any time away from the story itself. And we have to start with Julie Cellini, who your Lincoln story started about 1975, and we're going to hear about that. And I believe in the early 1980s you were placed on the board for the Illinois State Historical Library.
Correct.
And then in 1985, with the creation of the brand new Illinois Illinois Historic Preservation Agency, better get that right, you were the chair of that board and remained on that board until, 2010, I believe.
Yeah.
That's a long time. Next, we have Susan Mogerman, who started her, I'm sure you started your career before this, but I know that you had a long tenure with Governor Jim Thompson as the deputy press secretary. Lots of stories involved with that, I'm sure. And I'm going to have the opportunity to hear some of them here in a few weeks. But then in 1991, you were selected to be the new director for the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency and stayed on that position until what year?
I think
2002.
Mm-hmm.
And then Bob Coomer, who started with the agency in 1985 at its inception, but before that time, I know you were in Department of Conservation, and you were dealing with historic sites. And when you came over in 1985, you continued as the superintendent of historic sites, and then took over the mantle as director of IHPA in 2004, I believe, and retired in 2007.
That was 3 years. That was enough, Mark.
That was enough. Okay. Well, we're going to have fun, and most of this, obviously, is going to be the three of you talking about this. I wanted to start with this question. And I'm sure this is a question a lot of people would think about. Abraham Lincoln. There is nobody who has the prominence and the importance in American history like Abraham Lincoln. And I don't need to tell you or the audience, he has an international reputation. And then you've got the Civil War, which is the seminal event in American history. And if you don't understand the Civil War and slavery and Abraham Lincoln's role in the Civil War in that era, then you just can't really understand American history. So the question is a straightforward one. Why did it take so long? And Susan, we'll start with you on that.
Well, a very quick explanation is there was no money. We had dreams. We had started getting going before we had a penny, and it just doesn't work that way. So then you keep going, and you start begging. Little cups appear on people's desks, and you go wherever there's a clue that someone's interested in it. But it takes a lot of cajoling to get the amount of money, and I don't think we're ready to disclose the amount of money that this place took. Because I think if we had ever had an idea that it was going to be as huge as it turned out to be and cost as much as it cost, I can't imagine that we would have actually gone ahead with it. So it's good we didn't know.
What's your perspective on that question, Bob?
Mark, it took, funding came from 7 different sources, all the way from private funds to capital development funds, transportation enhancement funds. And like Susan said, we uncovered every stone in order to find the money to make this happen. And it came through every year, it took a new appropriation. And I think that had a great deal to do with taking as long as it took. And it's a big facility on top of that. It took a lot of input went into making this facility happen. And it just didn't happen quickly. But having said that and the time that it took, the end result is what you see. And I used to love coming here and sitting and watching the public and seeing the public's reaction. And, it wasn't always the case at every site that everybody walked away extremely happy, but they did out of here. So the fact that it took long, that's okay when the end result ended up being what it is, I think.
Well, Julie, your turn for that. And really, any story that involves the creation of the library and museum has to start with your story. So let's start with that. Tell us about how you first got involved with, let's start at the old state capitol. I think we're talking about, 1976, 77 time frame?
A little bit later than that, but it actually started even before that. I was a newspaper reporter and got the lucky assignment of covering the dismantling of the old state capitol in the center of downtown Springfield. Probably the first historic preservation project other than Jackie Kennedy redoing the White House. The first one that took place in the United States, and it was taking place here. And I got to do some stories on it. Fell in love with the whole thing, fell in love with the old Capitol, and thought, gosh, if there's ever a time in my life when I can do something to somehow support that building, that's what I want to do. And then there came a hiatus in my life. I was married, I had kids, I had a little bit of time, and I went down there and I volunteered. And loved the building. I knew so much about it. I still had my notes from all those stories I'd written, and it was a disappointment. And I started lobbying anybody I could corner to do a better job on the old Capitol. And in the process, started to learn more about Illinois history and about the sites and about the rest of what Illinois had and held, and kind of moved on from there. I eventually became the first chairman of the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency, but that was not until 1985. In the time going up to that, I was lobbying to get things for the old Capitol, and as a volunteer, I asked Jim Hickey, who was the head of the Lincoln collection at the time, could I see it, because we didn't even really have any kind of an orientation to give to school kids when we took them through. And he took me down into the bowels of the building and opened up the safe, and he handed me a pair of white cotton gloves. And I said, why the gloves? And he said, because I'm going to hand you the Gettysburg Address. 232 words that historian Gary Wills said remade America. And it was right there in my hands, and I was hooked. And I'm still hooked.
But what did you think in terms, you're not in the old state capitol, I understand. You're underneath the old state capitol now,
Exactly.
right? And what did you think about the way the Gettysburg Address was being preserved?
Badly. But all of the artifacts and the books, I mean, it was no place to have a library and a historical library, the things that Illinois treasures. And, I mean, the place was already getting moldy, and this was a long time ago. It was simply something that somebody thought of at the time. It was not a time for great architecture, frankly. And people did some experimental stuff that didn't work. Putting a library underground, I think, was one of them. And I'm probably going to hurt some feelings. I'm sorry, I don't know who's out there. But we all talked yesterday and decided no holds barred. Well, we're all too old to worry about it.
Well, did you have a vision somewhere in these first few years you were affiliated as a volunteer and then on the board itself, that there needed to be something done in terms of presenting all of this material to the public?
Absolutely. Yeah. I thought, why should a very few of us who were brassy enough to ask to see things be the ones to get to experience this? It needed to be open up. It needed to be shown to the public. I mean, Illinois has treasures. I don't know, I've got the numbers someplace in all my notes here of what Illinois actually owns, but it's like, what, 280,000 items make up just the Lincoln collection? The thought that we were not really merchandising this for the state, for the sites, for the public, for kids, for everybody. There was so much more that we could do. And, we are Lincoln Central for the world. Look at all the wonderful Lincoln sites that we had here, and we weren't really pulling together. So, yeah, I had ideas. I used to annoy the heck out of Susan and Bob and Tom Schwartz, who was the state historian, that why can't we do this? Here's an idea. Why can't we move forward with it? Finally, we did.
Susan, I'm going to turn it over to you because what I'd like to have you do is to explain a little bit more about what that early vision was for what you guys wanted to accomplish in presenting this material.
I think we didn't have a clue as to what we wanted to do. What we knew we needed to do is update the way that tourists saw what was here. There's so much to see, as Julie said, and the kids, when they came from school, were put on a bus. It was a long day. They were tired by the end of it. They were grouchy by the end of it. And the story of why we still love Lincoln is one that was being told in kind of like book chapters. They go to the house and they see where they lived. They go to the old state capitol and they see where he worked. And you get these stories and stories and stories. And by the time they left back on the bus again, people were ecstatic because they had been walking and doing, and they were cranky and whatever. But the end result, and I want to say it was exactly what we wanted. Children left here with books in their hands. We got letters, thousands of letters, from teachers, from parents who thought their children could never be anything because they'd never read a book and didn't like school and didn't like anything and blah, 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 blah. And so the staff who dealt with the story had suggested that we needed to update and find a way to get the children involved in the story.
Doesn't that mean you need to get it out of the basement underneath the old state capitol?
Yeah, and get away from the stuff that was eating up the paper and books and threatening. I mean, this is, as Julie said, historical documents. Some of them were very, very unable to be handled because they were fragile and dry, and sometimes they were wet because sometimes you had rain coming in. There were just a number of sequences of things happening all the time, and they were not helpful things. So getting to the story was the next piece.
Bob, what I'd want you to address a little bit, since you were superintendent of historic sites, and Susan already has talked about some of this, but it's more than just these documents that we're talking about. There were other historic sites that you were in charge of as well.
Yes.
Can you weave that into the story for us?
Well, like Susan said, we were telling part of the story of Lincoln being a young adult, trying to figure out what he was going to do in life at New Salem. We would tell about the law career in the law office. We talked about his legislating and his political career in the old state capitol. But segments were being, all throughout central Illinois. We were responsible for that, but our emphasis at each one of those sites was that particular aspect of Lincoln's life. Nowhere was, could someone go and get a pretty concise idea of what Abraham Lincoln, who he was and how he got to be and what he ended up accomplishing. It was, told in segments, in chapters, as Julie said, or excuse me, as Susan said.
Do you remember, and this might be very difficult to identify a specific date or even a year, but when the idea was that, well, perhaps we can build a new state historical library?
Yeah, the idea was there. This lady championed that idea for more than 20 years. Credit needs to be given. I don't know how many doors she knocked on. I'm sure she had bloody knuckles, and she would knock on the door, and
a lot of them got slammed.
and she heard no. The answer to her question was no. We don't have the money to move in that direction. she never got discouraged. She would go to the next place and knock on that door, and she continued to do that until finally there became an avenue where a door was cracked open, and we began to see things begin to happen. It's how it started for the museum itself. Judy Bartopinka, who was senator at the time, was able to get us a small appropriation. And by small, $80,000, as I recall. That $80,000 was to improve the exhibit case that the Gettysburg Address was shown at the old state capitol. It was like, we can do that, but this may be the opportunity to make something else happen with that. We hired a firm who had done the exhibit work at Cahokia Mounds, Jerry Hilferty out of Athens, Ohio. And he put together some boards for us, some drawings of what something in the museum sense of something for Lincoln could be. It was minimal, but it was something physical, visual that we could address. And we toted those things all over the state of Illinois. And she toted them beyond the state of Illinois, showing what something might happen to be. And that was really the beginning, that exhibit case for the Gettysburg Address.
When I understand that seed money, $80,000 that you got from Topinka, was that really what you're looking for, a better display case?
No, we were looking for, frankly, any money we could get, because you can only talk to people so much. We're visual. We needed something that would actually show them, gosh, if we could ever launch this project, this is what it would look like. And it would tell the whole Lincoln story, and it would be a place that people could actually see the artifacts, and we could move them in and out of whatever this was going to be, because we didn't even have a name for it for years. But we were ridiculous. We were the road show. We hauled that stuff around. We stood in more drafty hallways over at the legislature waiting for our 5 minutes to get in there, and it's, Susan, come on, move them. Well, wait a minute, this one's got a rip. Get some tape. And we'd try it again, and we were really a vaudeville act. But the idea was that think of the possibility. Think of what we have here that belongs to our state that nobody has. Washington doesn't have it. It's right here. We own Lincoln, but we've got to give it to people in a way that they can digest it, appreciate it, learn from it, and we need a facility to do that. And most of the time, they listen politely, give us a little time, next. It wasn't until Jim Edgar came in, because we tried it with Jim Thompson, too. Fine, where are you going to get the money? But when Edgar became governor, we were $1 billion in the red. I think it was the biggest deficit then that Illinois had ever had. And he became, those of you who are Springfield people and know politics, you know, he was Governor No. And so everything we asked for, great idea, no, next. And then late in his administration, things began to turn around because we had all those years of austerity budgets. And I got a phone call, and it was one of his staffers, and he said, you know, all those stupid pictures you and the staff have been over here with all these years. And I said, yeah, are we in trouble? No, why don't you come over and talk to the governor and bring those dumb pictures with you, too. Bob, Susan, showtime.
Well, and I'm sure it helped that Edgar he loved history, and he loved the story of Abraham Lincoln. He loved the political biographies as well. That I'm sure that helped open those doors.
And he had built a library. He had built the state library when he was Secretary of State. So, I mean, that was his baby. So he loved libraries. He loved research. He'd been a history major at Eastern. We did our homework, and, you know, guy wants blue, turn on the blue light. And so we went over and we tried to sell the project.
Well, the next chapter of the story I want to have discussed a little bit goes back to you again, Julie. And that's now that you've got a little bit of money, and I think there was a promissory note of about $40 million, but there was maybe about $4.9 million seed money that you could start really doing some serious work on this. But I know that you and your husband went out to California. Can you pick it up from there?
Yeah, there are so many heroes in this story. One of them was Dick Durbin. We didn't leave anybody out when we did our dog and pony show. And I had this idea. Actually, my husband really pushed the idea because he's one of these guys that you got to spoon feed him history. I like to read it. He wants to see it on a screen or have it handed to him. And he loves Disney, and he loved the Hall of Presidents. And I always drag him to historic sites, and he usually is bored. And he says, why doesn't Disney do history for you? And why don't you do something that this guy does good history, does his research, but presents it to the public in a way that they can relate to it? And that's the way to sell this project. It's the way to do this project. So Dick Durbin happened to, I think he may have been his college roommate. Happened to have a very close relationship with the person who worked for Disney and did all their lobbying in Washington. There's that bad word, lobbying. So Dick very kindly put me together with his chief lobbyist, and the guy said, all right, here's the address. Go out there to Anaheim, and there aren't any signs. It's going to be a little hard to find. So I show up in a cab to meet the Imagineers, not even knowing what the Imagineers are, and I go to this giant white complex of buildings, and there's not a sign. That's the address, but there's nothing to lead me anywhere. And finally, I walk and walk and walk, and I find a door, and it's got a slight, like a schematic of Mickey Mouse on the door. And I thought, can I be here? And I open the door, and it's like walking into maybe the Magic Kingdom. There are artists, there are technical people, there are libraries that open up, there are archives. These are the people who make the Disney magic. And they were so kind, first of all, because Dick had opened the door, but secondly, because they remembered great moments with Mr. Lincoln, which was the centerpiece of the New York World's Fair way back in the 70s, I think, 70s or 80s.
I think it's like maybe even 64.
Okay, but long, long ago. And Illinois, I think it was Governor Kerner at the time, had worked with Marty Sklar, who was then head of the Imagineers, and they had allowed Illinois artifacts to go into this. They had worked with them with the scripts, and so they had a soft spot for Illinois, and they were more than happy to haul out all the stuff that I didn't even know anything about and show me what Illinois had done for them. And it began a wonderful friendship that goes on to this day. And they never charged us a dime.
Susan, I want to have you pick up the story from here because, as I understand, there is not just a couple people now, but the next thing was a group of people went out to Anaheim and to hear a presentation that was being made on, because these people apparently got interested in your project.
They did, and we were happy that they did for a while. And then it became a little on the burdensome side, and some of it was depressing. I'll tell you about the worst day that I experienced. They kept sending these groups of people. Each of them had a different, something that they wanted to see and do. And so we'd get 3 people here and 2 people here. They'd be all over the city. So they came in and they wanted to make a presentation. Great. And so we sit down and they turn on the lights or turn off the lights, and they're showing what they had taken pictures of downtown. And what they had taken pictures of was about 28 parking lots. Do you need these parking lots? Why do you need so many parking lots? It was, first of all, it was humiliating, And then secondly, you're sitting there and you're going, I don't know. I know who's supposed to be there, I don't know if that's, all the state workers who are downtown all the time. And I thought, is this really what they're going to talk about? And then they started talking about locations, and there was a whole day that we spent on triangulation, things that you had no idea what they were talking about. These people were absolutely brilliant. They invited us to come out to California, and they wanted to put on a work day. And they didn't need a lot of our people, but they needed people who could give them the information that they needed to start looking at this. So we sent them a box of things about Lincoln. It was huge. It was like this. And we sent it a couple weeks before we went out there, and there were 4 of us who went to this kind of the same kind of building. It was white, and there was nothing about it that was Disney-ish. And they started the first day, and they introduced everyone. They had a philosopher. They had people who were trained to direct traffic and direct people and direct all the activities that take, people where they need to go. I'm thinking, well, this is interesting, but it's not what I expected. And so they went back to California, and then there were 4 of us who also went back to California, and they were going to give us a report and some suggestions. And so we had conquered triangulation and what that meant. And they had, for every one thing that they did, there were 7 things to follow. And so I was the last one there. And on the last day that I was there, they did a presentation. It was very, very small details and things. Everything that we sent them came up during these sessions.
So they actually read all that
Oh
material
my
you
God,
sent?
yes. And it was like, really? You know this? I mean, they knew everything. They were just highly motivated. And this goes back to the fair, the World's Fair in what was it, the 60s?
Yeah.
And they had a mechanical Lincoln that was the hit of that event. And we actually had a letter from Walt in the files. I don't know if it's still there, but there was a letter where he talked about his great enthusiasm for what we do, and Lincoln in large and in the smallest detail. And so I was really looking forward to getting this final report from them. And it had triangulation.
You keep mentioning triangulation, but we're getting more and more curious of what that is.
Triangulation is how you group the things that you have to see. So they didn't just want one building. They wanted to triangulate between the old state capitol and the other sites, the home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They'd draw these little designs, and they would have, well, we got the old state capitol here, so we really could use something over here and something over here. Well, Julie had sent me with directions, and there was not a single word that coincidentally was what Julie wanted to see downtown. So they finished their report, and it was I could see that it was important, and I could see that they obviously knew what they were doing, and I didn't have a clue. And so they had this stuff on a blackboard, and I see what they've done to where they wanted it located. And I said, no, we can't have it located there. It has to be downtown.
Well, what was some of the locations they had?
Well, there were just a couple.
We talked about New Salem.
They did, yeah. They wanted big. They want, the Disney way is big. So
Try
they wanted.
try selling that.
Well, it sounds like this is when it went from, well, let's see if we can, this is really ambitious, maybe we can actually build a new state historical library, to it's now going to be becoming the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum.
Well, except we didn't have the name for years yet.
Yeah.
They also offered us that animatronic Lincoln, by the way, which we seriously considered taking and then thought better of it. But they needed to place it somewhere, and they felt they had this debt to Illinois, and they would have given it to us if we had taken
Well, the letter that Walt Disney wrote was a tearjerker. I mean, he was really, really, really devoted to the concept, and I think they would have gone on with the planning to help us for as long as it took.
But all this opened our eyes to possibilities. What you could do. I mean, they told us you've got everything and you've got nothing. You've got the greatest president this country has ever produced, maybe ever will. You've got sites, you've got historians, you've got the infrastructure to build something magnificent. But if you don't do it in a way that nobody has ever done before with an American president, you're going to fail your subject. And it was uplifting. And we went from, wow, we need to build a building and show all this stuff, to we want to give people a personal encounter with the president who saved the Union.
But you'd been working on it for close to 20 years by now and finally got $40 million. That had to be a little bit intimidating to realize, oh, we might need a lot more than $40 million.
Well, we didn't talk about it much. Yeah. Especially when anybody was taking notes.
Bob, I'd like to turn it over to you now, because I know that some of the other things that were going on back here, but you guys, there was a group of people who hit the road and went to a lot of different museums around the country. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. And that was, Mark, we went to, if not all of the presidential museums, nearly all of them. And not only just museums, we went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. We went to the Gene Autry Museum in California to learn from what they were doing and what they were doing well. We also learned what they were doing and what they were doing not necessarily so well, to help us get some idea of how we went forward. That was a major learning experience. And at that point in time, we were close to hiring the exhibit designer, and that was what came along next. We went through a selection process, and we were very fortunate with the Capital Development Board, because typically a capital project for a historic site location would be Capital Development Board would select the architect, they would select the contract, they would award the contract, etc. There was enough foresight and enough effort that the group that became involved with selection got extended beyond Capital Development Board. Julie served on the board, or on the selection committee. Susan, myself, there were representatives from the state of Illinois, or excuse me, from the city.
There were probably 20 of us.
Yeah, it was big. And it was a matter of, all of us looking at, who the possible exhibit designers might possibly be. One thing that came away from Disney was consider, beyond what you've seen with other presidential museums, people that could do something a little different than that. And we went through the selection process, and the committee came up with wanting to award the contract to Bob Rogers and BRC Imagination Arts.
Now, this is a question I wanted to ask you, because in the layman's mind, I'm thinking, well, don't you need to have the architect before you have the exhibit designer?
And that's the typical mindset, especially at that point in time, I think, Mark. And it was, build the box and then fill the box.
I want to, because this will get lost. When we were going to all these places, we asked a lot of the same questions at every stop. And my assignment was, if you were to do this again, how would you change what you did? And almost without exception, the answer to that was, we would build we would have the program first and then build the building around it, because they never had enough room for anything, couldn't anticipate what would come in terms of the story or whatever they were doing. And that was a very valuable lesson.
And Susan's speaking about primarily presidential libraries, but there also were interpretive centers that told us the same thing. But the presidential library museums that people go to are usually the money spent on the architecture. And you get this great-looking building that's a monument to the great man, and then they try to stuff the stuff inside. And so you don't get that personal encounter. First of all, there isn't room for it. Secondly, there isn't the impetus to go ahead. They've built the monument. And so we went to CDB. We pushed Bob out in front of us to do the talking to him because he spoke their language, that we wanted to hire the person who was going to create the experience for the visitor first, and then pick an architect who could work with that person. And CDB was amazingly amenable. It turned out to be a really good experience all the way around. It was state government maybe at its best.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree on that one.
Well, that's not often said in Illinois. Bob, tell us then how you did end up with BRC. Bob Rogers.
Yeah, we did. We looked at the people who had designed the programs for the other presidential museums, and the thing that we came back with, and Julia's made the point a few times, we came with the term of engaging the visitor, and the visitor of all ages. We weren't shooting for the scholars. We weren't shooting for the school age kid. We were looking to serve everybody, and to engage that person. What we saw was a typical history museum at the museums, and that, unfortunately for me, and it's a lot of glass boxes with artifacts behind the glass, and we learned fairly quickly that wasn't what we wanted to do. Bob offered the best opportunity to deviate from that. It was a risk, I think. It was a risk from the standpoint that we went outside the mold from the standpoint of presidential museums. But having said that, and again seeing the end result and seeing the things that engage, a holovision as an example in the museum, we didn't see that anywhere else. But that has been, to me, the part that has brought the wide range, I mean the multitude of people's interest, from school-age kids all the way through senior citizens who, when you grow older, you learn a new appreciation for history, it seems. But everybody, and that was what we got the best opportunity with Bob Rogers. Bob was extremely creative, and from the standpoint of seeing some of the work that he did, we went out to Knott's Berry Farm and saw the holovision there, and it just blew my socks off. You walk out of there and you're intrigued by the history, but you're also going, how in the world did they do that? Bob would never answer that question.
I wonder which one of you would like to tell me the spent bullet story.
That's Susan.
So there is a process of how you hear the stories. It's that each of the presenters is trying to get you to choose them, and they were not really what we were looking for. They were kind of flat and what you see everywhere.
Cookie cutter,
right. And then comes...
But expensive cookie cutter.
Yeah.
I mean, there were people who built scale models of the unfinished Capitol building and wheeled them in with scaffolding and set them up in the CDB conference room so that, to just impress the socks off of us, and yet no real story with it. And I remember Alex Scranton, DMCD, stood in the middle of the room with some giant, expensive something that they'd built to show us, and he's trying to sell, and all of a sudden he looks up and he says, I would kill to get to do this project. So this was never under the radar. I mean, we had the top people coming here to Springfield because by then the Holocaust Museum had opened in Washington. The speculation in their industry was, you're going to pick Ralph Applebaum because look at, people can't wait to get into the Holocaust Museum. He's the guy who's going to do Lincoln. There were stories about it. Who are these people going to pick? So we all sit there, not exactly knowing what it is we're going to do, and then...
Well, first I want to say Applebaum sent like a third vice president, and he made this big deal about the big attraction would be this actor who would be dressed up like Lincoln, and he'd do Lincoln speeches. And when he was done, I said, do you have a plan B? And he said, do I need a plan B? I said, I think so, because we buy Lincolns by the pound here. we don't need another Lincoln. And he said, oh, did you think that was my presentation? Well, that was the whole thing? I said, yes. And he said, no, I don't have it with me. But we have another plan. I said, okay, you let us know when you can show us that one. And there were, it really was kind of strange. Well, anyway, there was this glass bottle, I think, if I remember right. Was it in a glass bottle?
No, what I remember is Bob Rogers. This is after people are doing all these dog and pony show things. And Bob Rogers, who head of BRC Imagination Arts, who we eventually hired, passed around a little ball of lead. And we're all like, what? And he said, this is just like the ball of lead that killed Lord Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar and changed British history forever. It is a priceless artifact. It sits in a very famous British museum in a glass case, and people walk right by, and they never know that this literally was the thing that changed everything for the British, or they'd probably be ruled by Spain. And we all were like, so? And he says, do you see the analogy here? This is just like your Gettysburg Address, your Emancipation Proclamation, all the treasures that you have and hold. You put them in a glass case like they put this bullet in a glass case, and people are going to walk right by. And of course, what's missing is the story. And as he pointed out to us, there wasn't a better story anywhere than the Lincoln story that we have right here in Springfield. But if we miss that opportunity, why do it? And at that point, we're all like, we get it. And he got it.
He got it.
It was exactly what we were looking for, the story. And he went on with the story that the bullet, there was only one bullet that killed
Lord Nelson.
Yeah, Lord Nelson. And his men were so devoted to him, they could not bury him at sea. So they took the body back to England, and
In what? What did they take it back in?
they
That's a good
put it
point.
in a barrel,
Of
and
Of?
a barrel of very mighty, wonderful drink. And then there were things going on in London before they got there, and they went on for weeks to treasure this man. And so the men couldn't fathom just putting him in the ground. So they put him in the barrel, and then they came back at different times, I guess, over the years, and they would take their cups, dip it in the drink, and make a speech about how he was loved and how he was missed, and did it for years apparently.
They got us.
I'm sure you had to realize at that moment that you possess, you said it already, we've got the Lincoln story. It's not just these artifacts.
That's it.
We have the story here.
But without the story, you've just got stuff. And so it was Bob's idea from the very beginning. You know, a lot of you are volunteers here in our museum. It's studded with stuff. But you understand, you walk through the storyline, and so you know that when you see a piece of the Lincoln White House china, you know what their life was like with their kids. You're in that realm of the museum, and now this artifact has a context, has a story around it. And that's true of the entire museum. There are so many things that they gave us that most of us just missed. For example, the music. All the music in the museum was written for the museum. It's all derivative of music that Lincoln heard in his lifetime. And it changes, the tempo changes depending on when our designers wanted to move faster through the passageways that are not exactly the easiest to get through. When they want you to feel the emotion of it. It's a funeral dirge when you watch the Civil War in 4 minutes. That music is funereal. They're all ditties that the soldiers heard, that Lincoln heard during his time, but they're done in beats and measures to get to your heart as the odometer of death continues to move up. Everything in that museum, the colors in it are all thought out so that they're playing with your emotions. We went from all these different presidential facilities, and we took notes. Susan and I, get together at the end. What did you see? Where did people gather? The reason that we have the First Lady's gowns in the Blue Room is because in our notes we often saw that people, not just women, but people gathered around the clothing that they wore. How were we going to do this? Well, everybody pretty much had seen pictures. They knew what Lincoln wore, but what did the women wear? And that's the reason that it's there, because we saw so many people who take those artifacts seriously. We wanted to go along with it. We had long discussions about guns. It was a different time when we were planning this place. Do we want guns in there? The N-word. It's all over a lot of the manuscript material that we originally looked at, because that's what people said then. And we want to be authentic. Do we want to say this in the museum? And it was one of the few times that we even took it to the IHBA board. What do we do? And everybody decided it was disrespectful, and we couldn't use that word, and so it's not there.
Bob, I wonder, since we're talking about that issue, about slavery, do you remember the discussions about how slavery should be portrayed in the museum?
I do. We were a part of a charrette, and the charrette was basically, we had a gathering of interest representing education all the way from elementary education through college education. We had tourism people, we had our historians, a large group, and by large there were in excess of 20, 25 people with particular interest of what this should be included in the museum. And we sat down and talked about the various subject matters of, we think these things should be included, and then it was a discussion, and Bob Rogers and his people would do drawings representing how that could be portrayed. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience, something I certainly will never forget. But the issue of slavery came on the table, and it had to be talked about. How do we go about doing this? And I very, very distinctly recall, and to me it's the most moving exhibit in the museum. But there was a photograph in the library, an historic photograph. It showed a male slave sitting on a stool, and it's in this exhibit actually, with just his back is just a massive welts, and we're going, that's horrible. That represents how the slaves were being treated, and it was great. There was a black professor from southern Georgia, as I remember. It's a university, small college in southern Georgia. And she was very quiet, but she said, that would show the horrors of slavery. But she said, if you really want to tell how bad it is, show a slave auction. Show the family literally being torn apart, never to be a family again. The child never to see a mother or a father. And that exhibit that we have in the museum, it's the most, I mean, everything is wonderful. But I go there and I'm touched every time I stand in front of that exhibit. And it came from that charrette, with this lady saying, yeah, if you want to tell that story, this is what I would suggest you consider. And what a wonderful suggestion it was. But we had input like that all along. There was an elementary education teacher. We talked about this yesterday. And he was talking about, the school-age children coming through and how they reacted to the exhibits. And that all went into the component of what we ended up with. Example, it was being seriously considered that the House of Representatives where Lincoln is laying in state, that it be an open casket. And it was like, children coming through here, seeing that, taking that vision away is more than we want to see. More than what we want our children to see, our school-age kids to see. And so it was wonderful that we had that kind of input. It wasn't a matter of a handful of people sitting down trying to determine this. It came from a multitude of interest. And I think that's what's made it, again, part of the success that it is.
We've been talking quite a bit about the creation of the exhibits. It's probably mentioned here that April 2nd, we all get a chance to hear Bob Rogers again. And I would certainly encourage the audience to come to that.
Put it on your calendar.
You've got to come see Bob Rogers. It's a show.
And ask him about why Willie isn't shown peeing in the stove in the Lincoln Law Office. It was the one time we ever talked him down and vetoed what he wanted to do.
Or where you were sitting, Bob was going to have, it was from New Salem, there was going to be a glass container of bed bugs was going to break on the floor, and then you were going to feel something moving across your feet. The lady said, that's not going to happen.
That might be the quickest way to empty the theater. What I'd like to finish with in the specific questions here is one for you, Julie, and if you can just talk in general about getting that last piece of money from the state of Illinois.
Well, I'm gonna say something that I debated whether to say, but what the heck, we're all friends. We actually didn't have a commitment for the money to build the museum when the library opened. We had picked the team. We had picked the exhibit people. We had picked the architect. We had a beautiful library building. The president's chief of staff came, and all the dignitaries were on stage. We had the big opening. This was 2002, and there had been no firm commitment to go forward. There was the assumption, but nobody had raised their hand and said, I'm going to raise the money for this. I'm going to make this happen. And the person who did it was George Ryan. He really inherited something that had been going from the Edgar years. And frankly, it was Mrs. Ryan who loved history, who embraced it. I went to her very early on and said, I'd like to bring the staff in. Susan, Bob, Tom Schwartz, who could not be here tonight, our wonderful, wonderful state historian who kept us all honest through this whole thing. But could I bring the staff in, and could they do the dog and pony show for you, and maybe get you interested in this project? And she said, I swear to God, honey, I don't need no dog and pony show. I'm in. And with her came the governor, and came the governor's people, and came the Capital Development Board, and came the funding, the persuasion. We went out to Washington, and I testified before the Speaker of the House, Denny Hastert. The Ryans greased the skids. Mrs. Ryan sat there. They were good buddies on a first name basis, and she'd say, "Now take it, Julie, and tell him what we're going to do." And as luck would have it, Denny Hastert taught high school history, and he got it. And by the end of it, he said, "Yeah, we can do this. We're not supposed to. It's not in the legislation. You got a president from the wrong century to have the presidential library money, but there's only one Lincoln, and we can do it." But it took. I mean, this was never a one-person, a two-person. This was everybody talking to everybody, bringing everybody along, and it took Governor Edgar, and it took Governor Ryan, and we weren't finished when Governor Ryan left, and it took Governor Blagojevich to finish it, to get us the money so that we could, in fact, hire the staff and open this up. And I mean, state government is complicated, and this thing, it really did take 20 years.
Okay, what I'd like to do now is if you've got some questions, if you haven't already passed them out to the aisles, and pick up some questions for us. Oh, I already have questions. Oh, my. I do have a couple things I wanted to finish with here before we go to the questions from the audience. Bob Rogers, he's been talking about him a lot. He had a quote that he used to describe people, the kind of people that it takes to see a project like this come to fruition. And here's his quote. It takes the determined fool with no quitting sense.
She's not a fool. She's not a fool. That's her.
So, my question for all of you, but I think we'll let Julie start on this one. What did keep you going? I mean, you didn't really strike anything at all until you were into this 15 or 20 years. What kept you going all those years?
Well, I'll get a little corny here. In my whole life, I only ever fell in love with two men. And one of them was Abraham Lincoln.
How about the other two? No, the other two people. That didn't come out at all.
That's good. Mark that. See, it wasn't me. The passion of this project. It was driven by a lot of hard work and a lot of effort and blood, sweat, and tears, as they say. But it was the passion of this project that kept you going through the hard times. I think the relationship of the importance of Lincoln, and there was a term, Lincoln happened at the right point in time. There was a point in time, and there was the right man for the job, and that was Lincoln. And they intersected, and Springfield was Lincoln. But it's that passion, I think, that we all felt that kept us going through the hard times, waiting for the appropriation, going out and trying to find additional funds that were necessary to do things like Union Station, building the clock tower, restoring the clock tower. But it was that passion, I think, for the project that kept all of us motivated, and getting enough success as we went along the way. Why did it take so long? It came in small increments. It didn't come as one lump sum. And waiting for that next piece of the puzzle to fall in place with the funding, it was that passion, I think, that certainly kept me going.
Susan?
It was exciting. It was really, really exciting, and a lot of it was, things that you could never see on your own. People would open their doors and show you their dirty laundry, and we went into a conference room that was floor to ceiling boxes of stationery, and I said, "Are you having something going on here that you're?" No, we just didn't plan enough space for it. It was like, I'd like to have been there when they were explaining this stuff to their boards. And you'd go from one place to another, and you'd get a big idea here, and then a lot of it is little tiny stuff. I remember going to a children's museum, and I asked the director, what's the hardest thing to control here? And she said, do not make any costumes that they put on their head. Well, my kids were young. I didn't know about lice by then. And I said, really? And she said, yes, really. And there were a lot of those. And we learned a lot just from other people's mistakes. And I'm sure there are people who've learned some things from our mistakes as well, but we don't have as many as we saw on the road. So I think it was just, I love museums. I love seeing the stuff. I loved hearing the stories. And I was so grateful for the things we learned by going to other places and asking them what was hard for you, what was bad for you, what worked, what didn't work. And there's a lot of the same threads, no matter where you go. There are mistakes that everybody makes, and you swear that you're not going to make them. And a lot of times we didn't, because we had seen things that were, suspicious.
But we also, and it would be not good if I didn't say this. We had Tom Schwartz, who is the foremost Lincoln historian ever. And Tom was on staff, and he channeled Lincoln through everything we ever did. And he was the ultimate yes or no as to whether or not we were going to do it. He was the go-to guy. He doesn't have the big string of books. He's not David Herbert Donald, or, he didn't merchandise it that way. He just immersed himself in Lincoln, and he gave it to this place. And because of Tom, we are absolutely authentic. I mean, think what a leap of faith it was to do this Disney sort of feeling with the greatest president this country's ever had. But we could do it because Tom was there with BRC every inch of the way to authenticate everything in this museum. The presentation goes to your heart and bridges over the intellectual part of it. But it's authentic, it's real, and it's because of Tom Schwartz. And I'm so sorry he isn't up here with us, because, boy, he really put his stamp on this place.
Okay. First question from the audience here. More questions. Aside from funding and finding the funding, what was the biggest hurdle in creating the library museum?
The location was a toughie. BRC wanted us to go to the Lincoln Home area. We kept trying to explain that you don't tear down history in order to build a facility for history. And at the same time, it was getting out in the media that this thing that had long just been talked about might be reality. And for sale signs were going up all over the Lincoln Home area. And the prices were astronomical. And it just got, we looked and looked and looked and looked, but we knew we wanted it to be where Mr. Lincoln walked to work. The proximity was so important. And I don't know whether lightning struck or the angels sang or something, but we tore down the police station.
We didn't tear it down, Julie.
Well, Springfield tore it down. And I opened
there was a family connection with that place, wasn't there?
There was. My father-in-law was chief of juveniles. I said to Bill, I read it in the paper, I said, look at this. We're on our way to Chicago. I said, we got to turn around. We got to go home. We got to try to get in to talk to the mayor. We got to have this site. He says, you don't want that site. I spent my childhood in that site. You don't want to I said, no, we don't want that site. We want the site. We don't want the building. And it was absolutely right. We, at the time, were planning for something much bigger than what we actually ended up with. We had to value engineer down. That's why not every piece of the Lincoln story that we planned is in this building, because you could only do so much. And there are places in this building where there are semi-bottlenecks. It was never planned to be because we were going to have more space. But this was absolutely the place to put it, and the best pocket park across the street that the city and the state could figure out a swap on. The train station that was falling into decay and was terrible. We could finally get some money through DOT. They had a heritage program that had to do with transportation. I used to write grants. I wrote the grant at midnight on my kitchen table, hand carried it out to DOT. You guys want to be heroes, or you want to spread this all over and nobody will ever know it's DOT money? We'll put you on the stage when you turn on the blue light again. Anything. Sell, sell, sell. And we got a huge grant that enabled us to do that park. That I think some of the money for the parking ramp came from that as well.
Yes.
It was like once in a while I'd think, does God really want this project? Is that why these things finally began to fall into place?
Just one brief comment, Mark. We didn't get everything. It wasn't a blank check. We had to do value, engineering here. There was a component. There was going to be 4 major pods, and one of them was going to be an IMAX theater, and we simply didn't have the funding for an IMAX theater.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because the next question I'm going to put to you, how much money did the museum take?
The grand total, and it's the complex. It's the library, it's the museum, it's Union Square Park, it's Union Station, is just over $155 million. $155 million.
State, federal,
There were
local.
7 components.
We put together a private fundraising entity. When all this was going on, then we built a foundation as well, and hired staff, skeleton staff, but we hired staff to go out and raise private money.
But we have one other advantage, and that is the volunteers that come day after day after day after day. I don't think there's any way that this place could be run without all the volunteers.
God bless the volunteers.
And I'm going to say one more thing that has really been bothering me for a long time. All this stuff in the paper. There's, opinions and opinions and opinions. If you want to get a true opinion of what's going on, talk to any of the volunteers down here. I did that a couple of months ago, and I said, people who are coming here, do they still like it? Is it still something that they leave here talking about? And they said, oh, yes, we never hear anything bad. And I would love to have a tour of journalists from Springfield who would come through here and ask real questions of people who really know what they're talking about. Because a lot of what I read is foolishness. Okay, that's off my back.
I still get calls from people who want to do projects. I did one 2 weeks ago for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They have closed down. They are going to totally retool, and they want to know, they sent a team here, they want to know how we did this for Lincoln because they want to do it for rock and roll.
Great. That's great.
We are known everywhere. 2 weeks after we opened, the Emir of Qatar came. He was on a swing through the United States, headed to the White House, read about it, said Lincoln was his hero. And this is not a democracy that this man runs, by the way. He came here. 3 weeks later, his ambassador came. We threw a little luncheon for him, and he handed us a check for $1 million. What we've got here is what anybody would want to have. Lucky us.
Okay, next question, and this one might be good to save for when Bob comes here, but I suspect one of you might be able to answer this. Where did the idea come from to do the Civil War in 4 minutes?
Dick Taylor.
Is that right? I didn't even know that.
Dick saw the Gettysburg.
Dick Taylor, to tell the audience who he is.
Dick Taylor at the time was in the Historic Sites Division, basically the historian, and the Tom Schwartz for the agency was Dick Taylor in Historic Sites. Dick Taylor had seen a mock-up of a map in Gettysburg, at the battlefield in Gettysburg, and he saw where things moved, and he kind of came out with this idea, and it was like, how can we tell, Civil War being such a major piece of the equation, how can we best portray this? And Dick gave the example of what he had seen in Gettysburg. Well, it became something a lot more technical, a lot more advanced than what he saw back, I don't know how many years back, but I think that's where the first idea for the Civil War in 4 minutes came.
Did anybody anticipate it would have that kind of impact on the public when they came and saw those numbers keep rolling on and the lines moving on the map?
It's the genius of Bob Rogers again, putting all those different components and seeing the lines move. And I think people of Civil War, there's a lot of kids don't have a clue what the Civil War was, and I think walking out of there, you come up with a pretty good impact of what it meant to this country, and the time frames and how it happened. But that again, and then all the photographs behind it, give credence to the lines moving, and you can push, it's the technical aspects of it. Push the button, pull up, the vision, and learn about, what that particular component is.
Okay, next question. Throw this one out for anybody. From your current perspective, what would you do differently today if you could?
I would still hire Richard Norton Smith in a heartbeat. I was so scared that when we opened, the historians were going to kill us, that they were going to say that we had Disneyfied the story of Abraham Lincoln. I was certain, because I'd lived this thing so long, that the public was going to get it, that the kids were going to get it, that people were going to love this place. But historians can be a tough crowd. And I thought, who's the person who could push that back? Who's the person who could articulate what it is that we did here? It didn't have to be somebody who had been any part of it. It had to be somebody who knew how to address the press and had the credentials and had the background and had the moxie. And so we hired the P.T. Barnum of Presidential Library.
That's true. Yeah.
Richard Norton Smith. And he came in and he got a few naysayers and he mowed them down. And we had almost no bad press. And you know what happens with bad press? It multiplies. There wasn't much of any of it to multiply. I've got a big, thick folder at home where a couple of people wrote Bounce the Rubber Lincolns. But mostly it was, wow, gee whiz, look at what they did. And I brought my wife and kids. And I thank Richard for all that. Richard did not want to stick around and run the library museum. And as he famously said to me a couple of months after we were open, and I care very much for Richard, I hope nobody takes this wrong. He said, Julie, I've got too much talent to care if there's toilet paper in the men's room. And so I would have put Richard on contract, and I think he would have been perfectly happy to do that.
Okay, next question. This one's fairly specific, but maybe somebody knows the answer. Does anyone know how Eddie Lincoln's tombstone got cracked?
Don't know.
Anyone out there? No. Okay. Uh-oh.
Oh, all right.
Catherine Harris has a story. I can't believe it.
Well, I truly do believe Tom told this to me. It was in the cemetery. I don't remember where. And it was turned over, and nobody knew what it was until somebody dug it up and saw what it was.
I've heard that too, Catherine, now that you say that. I don't know how the crack appeared, but I heard that same story.
Rolling over it with lawnmowers, cutting grass, tending to the cemetery.
Okay, next question. You've already mentioned that the IMAX was something that was not included in the plan. Was there anything else that was left out of the grand plan that you had to start with?
Nothing that big. I got to tell you a story on that one. I'll be very brief. We're sitting in a room with the Capital Development Board. We're looking at the budget. We're looking at how we're going to spend the money, and we came to a pretty quick conclusion that fourth major pod of the museum there wasn't funding for. So what gets eliminated? And I'm sitting there, and we're all taking it, of course, very seriously. And a guy who worked with, and we haven't talked about the city of Springfield. City of Springfield was a player here too, but Mark Gordon, who was an assistant to the mayor, Mayor Hissera, he cut out a piece of paper about that big around, like it came out of at that time bottle caps, Coke, one free IMAX theater, and handed it to me, and I just cracked up. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to get it built. No, we value engineered everything. We value engineered everything to get the biggest bang for the buck. But that was the biggest component, as I recall.
Yeah, that was a hard one to let go.
Yeah.
There were bells and whistles that we wanted to do. Bob wanted to create around the Lincoln cabin the scent of firewood and green trees, and it was a wonderful idea. But then we thought about people with allergies, and then we thought about lawsuits, and then we thought about what it would cost, and that one went away. Lincoln's Eyes, we went through so many scripts with that. It was actually longer. At one point, there were things in it that were a bit more controversial. It went through so many changes, so many. We can't have this, but we'll trade it off for that. I don't know what we'd do differently. Yeah. We were also crammed onto a not very big space when you think about it. With that lot that we got from the city, we got limitations.
The architect, I think, had grander ideas about what the structure would be, and again, we constantly kept in mind that it was the content, not the building, that was of importance.
I do have a question to build on that. The question about whether or not the architect was a little bit put out because that was the way things worked.
He wasn't a little put out. He was all put out. It was a pitiful thing that happened. At the beginning, he and the designer, of the program from Bob, they were right on track with one another. They were like Siamese twins until we had the day that we were presenting the budget, and the budget for the program was huge. 64 million. I don't remember, but it was
for all the exhibits you're talking
about.
Right,
for the exhibits.
It was the lion's share.
Because they were making the exhibits. They didn't just design them on pieces of paper. They were also making them. And the architect that we had is a very well-known architect with a lot of stuff that he carries around with him. And so they read the numbers, and the number for the architect was, I don't know, maybe a third. Do you remember what it was, Julie?
Yeah, enough that everybody was uncomfortable.
And he started getting really angry, and then he just walked out. And where the two of them had worked together on everything, he wouldn't even sit and talk. It was a very bad time, and you would think that they have more honor than that, but they never came back together.
Yeah, he was directly involved as a principal for the design, and at that point we worked with somebody under on his staff. Yeah. But having said that, She did a great job.
She did.
She did a great job, and she recovered. She listened to us, and we worked very closely, and she worked very closely with us. It was, it worked out in the end.
Okay. Next question then. I'm sure this is the case. Have the Disney people come here to see the museum after its completion, and what did they think?
Well, Bob has been here like a number of times with people that he brings with him. And I think that we are his display.
Well, if you go on his webpage,
for the
you
world.
can find it easy enough, I can tell you that much.
Yeah. A lot of the people that Bob worked with, he very proudly has brought here. Bob has gone on to, he is now on the board of directors of the Academy Awards. He sent me an email before the Oscars the other night to tell me where he and Karen would be sitting and what Karen would be wearing and which stars would be all around them. We got the real deal when we got Bob Rogers, and he's done so many projects all around the world. He'll send me tapes of them or directions how to get there. If you're going to Malmo, Sweden, I just did a Saab exhibit there. Go see it. He's become a family friend, obviously. But of everything that he does, this is the capstone. This is the one he cares.
And this is
It's
where
in
he
his heart.
sends, a lot of people.
This is showplace.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. And he's smart because it is a showplace, and it is probably the finest thing he's done to date, which
Bob?
is saying a lot.
No, that's basically it. Bob is. We were forewarned by one of his competitors when we were in the selection process that you couldn't contain his ego. And he doesn't lack for ego, but that was never an issue for us. I shouldn't say never, but it wasn't a matter of trying to contain this guy. He listened to us clearly. He took direction from us clearly.
Well, it wasn't like this was the first guy with a fairly large ego that you people had been working with, I would think. And I think I know the answer to this one, but knowing everything it took to get where you got today, where you are today, would you do it all over again?
Yeah.
In a heartbeat.
It was a privilege.
Yeah, it was. People tell me, you had the chance of a lifetime, and my response is, no, it was a chance of 4 lifetimes. It took 4 lifetimes for this to get done, and thank God for this lady. Because if it weren't for, no, I'm serious. It needs to be said. Weren't for her, you wouldn't be sitting here. It wouldn't have happened.
Well, that might be a great way to finish, but I'm going to ask 1 or 2 more questions. Was the Federal Archives ever considered for archiving the documents?
We looked at, yes, NARA is the official presidential library repository, National Archives and Records Commission. But it only started building presidential libraries with Herbert Hoover. So we had a president born in the wrong century. And we did look at other presidential libraries. We remember when we all went to the Reagan, and we thought, here's a guy who's got some Illinois background here. We're going to see the movie star president. And it was kind of boring. There was only one exhibit in it, Reagan's humor, that people flocked to, and it was entertaining. But the rest of it was pretty flat. This was a movie star, and yet we didn't see it. Oddly, one of the places that grabbed me was the Jerry Ford Presidential Library Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where we met Richard Norton Smith. And I thought, this is the accidental president. What was he, president 2 years or something? It was a rainstorm. People were lined up around the block to get in. And we said, what in the world, Jerry Ford? And what they were there to see was Richard had gotten Grandma Moses's family to do a retrospective of her whole career, and he'd put it in his exhibit space. And all these people were there to see the Grandma Moses exhibit, so he's selling tickets like crazy in a rainstorm. And we walked into this museum in a disco, and there's all those awful clothes we all used to wear, that polyester terrible stuff, and it's all a big exhibit and strobe lights and all that music. And I thought, Richard, why this? He said, it places you in time. This is when that man was growing up and came of age. And then you opened a door and you walked down a nice little street, and here was a replica of the paint store where Gerald Ford had had his first job, except his name wasn't Gerald Ford. He was Leslie, I used to know his name, Leslie something, until he was like 14 years old. And then his mom married Jerry Ford, and they changed his name, and he became Gerald Ford Jr. And these were the things that Richard was merchandising, these storylines, in that museum. And I thought, let's take a better look at this guy.
Well, last question for us then. If you could redo anything in the museum, would there be anything you'd want to change? And maybe adding, we've talked about some of that, but anything that you'd want to change?
We don't need that bridge. We built the bridge because Ghosts of the Library was going to be in the library. And we were going to take people across, and it was going to be a symbol of scholarship meeting showmanship. And we were going to, the whole idea of Ghosts of the Library is to show you why libraries matter, why as repositories for artifacts, they are important in our civilization. And we thought this was a great symbol to do that. And then one of the engineers said, excuse me, you're going to walk hundreds of thousands of people on that bridge? I don't think so. And it was already in the plans. And so it's sort of a link. They go between the two, I think, with carts and things. I see people on it once in a while.
People who want to walk from one building to the next without going outside when it's 0 degrees out. Okay, I want you all to stay right here. I'll be right back. Because we have something for you. Bob Coomer, Susan,
Thank you.
and Julie. And I'll read what it's got on yours. I assume that the two others have something similar to this. Special thanks to Julie Cellini for your vision, talent, and dedication, allowing us to share your dream that is continuing Lincoln's legacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us tonight.